Hi, welcome everybody to the week 3 feedback video for mindfulness for wellbeing and peak performance. It's Craig and Richard here. Good to be with you again. Another great week, and we're really happy to see the really collaborative and supportive environment among learners, and great exchanges on the discussion board. Lots of good questions. People are becoming very aware too of the busyness of life as well, and that's an interesting topic in itself. You know that. And an interesting article has been creating a little bit of debate that we don't necessarily have more things that we do now, or longer hours and so on. It's perhaps in some ways the opposite, but I think that these days we're a lot busier in our minds, and we feel this sort of internal pressure which creates a kind of a busyness and hustle in modern life.
And maybe there's a big difference between busyness and productivity.
That's right. And is there a way that mindfulness can teach us to be calm and feel unhassled amidst a full and productive life? So there are lots of interesting questions, and also perhaps we've got a number of topics we might explore now. Multitasking has been striking a bit of a chord for people. Really.
It always strikes a chord in this course, Craig. Yeah. Certainly a lot of our learners have become much more aware of the habit, or even we could say the addiction to trying to multitask. And also the effects, really starting to notice that, especially when we're talking about complex multitasking, doing 2 or more complex activities at once, that it's really impossible. You know, it results in reduced performance, and the brain is unable to focus on 2 complex things at once, and it flicks the attention backwards and forwards with attentional blinks and a whole lot of different...
And if we don't have anything else to compare to, we think, oh, that's the way you do things and that's as good as it gets. And it's not until you compare, and experiments can be helpful, that you actually realise that these negative impacts on the quality of engagement, the effect on memory, the potential for errors, we don't realise that unless we really look at it.
Yeah, and then we start to notice, and then of course some learners have been experimenting with uni-tasking and really starting to notice the benefits of just focusing on one thing at a time. Actually becoming more productive, less stressed, and enjoying life more.
And it ties in, I think, with this sort of busyness, this sort of pressure, because we create a sense of pressure and when we're trying to multitask. And of course, in days gone by, that was a far less common kind of habit to get into. Is multitasking making it harder to concentrate? Absolutely. Absolutely. Because very often we're flicking back and forward, find it hard to engage and sustain attention. Got half a dozen emails open, none of them resolved, half read this and half conversations there. So it actually creates a kind of a burden that doesn't need to be there. And that really, when we do it habitually, really impairs the attention.
Absolutely. Yeah, some learners asked about how to teach their kids or teenagers to stop multitasking. And I think the simple answer is to lead by example here. You know, it's one thing to tell a kid, you should be focusing, the research says to unitask or that kind of thing. But if you walk into the house and, you're asking your kids how their day was and you're on your phone, or you're starting the dinner, or you're planning the shopping, or still thinking about work, that's of course modelling distractedness and this sort of multitasking mentality.
Whereas so we're teaching kids inattention.
Absolutely, kids are like sponges. We're teaching them inattention through our behaviours quite often. So good strategy will be to walk into the house tonight, ask your kid how their day was, and just listen to the answer, or ask your partner how their day was and really listen. And of course that starts to communicate in a very powerful way the benefits of really listening and unitasking.
A lot of schools, a lot of people at home are now starting to really think about, do we need to set some limits here? At the meal table, no mobile devices, you have dinner together and you engage together. In a class, no mobile devices. When we're teaching mindfulness, for example, to the students here at Monash, and it's a principle that laptops away, smartphones away, and so on, so that when a group's there, they're engaging with each other and actually listening to the conversation. So you can certainly set limits around these things, and that's helpful as well. Once a kid's in the habit of multitasking, then sometimes I think experiments, can be very good, because they may not actually realise that there's a different way, and sometimes you can't tell somebody, don't do that.
Or that it doesn't work. Often they think it does. Oh, I'm doing it just fine. I can do 5 things at once. No worries.
Yeah, and it's not until you actually test it and actually measure it, and that's that I actually, it's not working quite as well as I thought.
That's right. So helping them to understand the effects is useful. Some, just as you said, some good general principles and guidelines in the classroom or at home. You know, devices out of bedrooms and, you know, away at meal times, that kind of thing. Some learners asked, you know, should we be banning electronic devices from classrooms? Should we go that far? And I don't know about your opinion on that, but I think that's probably not practical. And I think actually, you know, technology's good. It's neither good or bad. It's all about how we use it. And I think the problem with digital technology is we just haven't learned how to use it properly yet.
Yes. And if in the classroom it's being used for the purpose that, you know, in the class, okay, everybody, I want you to get this article up or this particular thing, have a look at it now. Okay, now what do you know, if it's being used for the purpose of the class, but if it's just open and Facebook is open at the same time and everything else, it's just going to totally wreck the purpose of actually being in the classroom.
That's right. There are studies that show that in general, the more mobile phones are used in class, the lower the grades. And it's all about how it's used. So I think on one extreme, just allowing students to use technology however they want, probably not useful. Banning technology altogether, probably not useful. I think what we need to be doing is teaching people how to actually use the technology well.
There's quite a big study published recently, came out of RMIT in Melbourne, that was looking at social media use and academic grades for kids, and they found that more social media use, the poorer the grades. Maybe might be interested in the link to that study.
Yep.
Ambient background noise, is that multitasking and so on? Not necessarily. What we would want from a mindfulness perspective is not to say, in order to be present, pay attention, it's got to be totally silent and so on, because we want to be adaptable to be able to pay attention if it is silent, and a lot of kids these days struggle to pay attention if there's not constant noise. So to be able to pay attention when it's silent, to be able to pay attention when there's ambient noise, to be able to pay attention when there's a jackhammer going next door. If there's music in the background, and this question comes up a lot, is that multitasking? Well, if it's just there as an ambient sound, not too loud, not too aggressive, it's not necessarily a problem. But if the attention's on the music, then it's not on what they're reading. A sure sign is if there's any air guitar, if there's any drum riffs on the desk, that's attention on the music, having a great time, but the attention's not on the study.
And some learners even asked about the benefits of background noise or white noise, and I think someone mentioned there was a study that showed that it can help with creativity, and of course then there are other studies that show that you know, background sound can work against creativity and concentration. So I don't think there are any hard and fast rules about that. I think probably the most important thing would be to experiment and to notice what's the effect of having music on, what's the effect of not having music on, maybe comparing both of them and then making wiser decisions around that.
And if somebody says, I can't concentrate unless I've got noise, then I think there's something there to address.
Probably trying to drown out thoughts or background sounds or something like that.
That's right. And because you're going to step into an exam room one time where it's going to be silent and you need to be able to pay attention.
Except for that person next to you tapping the pencil on the desk. You might have to deal with that too,
there were questions around mindfulness and creativity that came up.
Yes, absolutely. So is mindfulness always about keeping the attention in the present? What happens when we're walking, you know, out in nature maybe, or just having a quiet moment and then something pops into mind? And I mean, obviously mindfulness isn't about slavishly always keeping our attention in the present. You know, sometimes we can very constructively plan or remember. And, you know, sometimes when the mind is just sort of relatively quiet, new insights can arise or memories can pop up, and whether that's through practicing mindfulness or just being out in nature perhaps. You know, the working memory, the short-term memory, can hold between 5 and 9 items in it, and we often keep that clogged up with all this mental clutter. And so if we take a moment just to allow ourselves to relax, you know, we sort of clear the cache, so to speak, and then new information can pop up. Yes,
I don't think it is so much from a mindfulness perspective that the mind's working on these things in the background and then all of a sudden we have an insight. I think from a mindfulness perspective it's more that in a simple moment, in the shower, going for a walk through the park, there's just a kind of a bit of mental space that comes from being just present, uncomplicated moment, and that space very often allows a really useful or insightful idea to arise.
That's right.
To actually come out of the clutter, and so it actually facilitates creativity.
Yeah.
And it's not about a lot of what we do when we're trying to be creative is overthinking things and churning, which is actually just confusion, and it does clutter creativity.
And I'd add to that when we're practicing mindfulness, we're also cultivating an attitude of openness, what's sometimes called beginner's mind, and just being aware of things as they are without fixed ideas about how they should be. And so, of course, that's really good for creativity as well. If we can approach a situation, what's possible here, rather than, oh, I know what this is, it's always going to mean this. So,
You mentioned before about planning and preparation, and also reflecting on a past experience. That can be done mindfully if in the present moment we are just planning and preparing. That's different to living an event before it's even happened, catastrophising and worrying and so on. We can reflect now in a past experience, which could be a very useful thing to do. But that's different to reliving that event. Why did I do that? And if we're getting stressed and anxious and agitated in our mind, pretty much we're reliving or anticipating and living something before it's happened.
Yeah.
So planning and preparation could be as much a present moment activity, but we retain the ability to distinguish between present moment and imaginary future or relived past. There was also some conversation around mindfulness, laziness, procrastination.
Well, yeah, a lot of learners have been noticing the habit of procrastination, that sometimes it's caused by stress and avoidance, sometimes
we only know about this in theory because we've never actually experienced it ourselves, but anyway, you might like to talk about it.
I think one day I'll get around to thinking about it in more detail, but for now... But, I mean, you know, quite often in courses when I'm teaching, people say, I didn't meditate or I didn't do that because I'm lazy. And I often think, well, you know, mindfulness gives us a tool to look a little bit deeper. What's underneath this label of lazy? And if we start to look a little bit deeper, quite often we can notice that maybe we're putting things off, not prioritising them. So I think it's a very useful thing to get a little bit deeper than that, that label.
Yeah, what's behind the avoidance, for example. And mind you, I mean, if we're pursuing something in life, or we're doing a course at university or doing a job that we're really not that interested in and so on, then we may actually need to see, well, why are we doing it? Why are we dedicating our life to something that really doesn't draw out our talents and our passion and so on? And so there is something to discover, as you say, what's behind the laziness.
Yes.
And the other thing too is when we are being lazy, is just to be mindful of that. Like, what do we get out of a really full night's sloth? Like, at the end of that, do we feel satisfied and fulfilled and so it is? Or when we've been putting off things that are really, really necessary, at the end of the night are we left with a grumbling dissatisfaction, a kind of an agitation, a kind of a sense of impending pressure and so on?
It can be good just to pay attention to that.
Yeah, to actually notice that that's what avoidance feels like. It's not satisfying, it doesn't give a sense of peace or rest. Paradoxically, when people pay attention to, eventually getting on with that thing that's been put off,
yeah, correct.
There's a kind of a rest and so on.
On the flip side to that, Craig, some learners were asking, you know, when we are being productive, should we focus on the process or on the goal?
Yeah. Well, this is an interesting paradox, I think, because when we step into something, it could be a project, it could be onto a sporting field, we often have a goal. And we know it's like a direction that we're heading in, and that's important in itself. We know why we're there. But actually, in terms of moving towards that goal, it's actually very much about paying attention to the steps, the process along the way. There's a kind of situational awareness, a kind of a broad awareness of the perspective within which the detail sits. But a person, for example, you're driving from one city to another, you know where the goal is, but you're paying attention as you're driving along the roads and where the turns are and so on. So the process is actually what gets us there. The goal is what sort of sets the direction.
Yep.
When we're so fixated on the goal, the outcome that I want to get, I have to get, if I don't get, and very often that sets up a kind of anxiety, can set up a kind of a worry and fear and so on, which very often takes the eye off the ball. And we make errors, we miss things, we get nervous, performance anxiety and so on. So these things actually get in the way of achieving the goal. So paradoxically, you know, great athletes, when they learn mindfulness, they get out and they can play, you know.
They literally keep their eye on the ball a little bit more.
That's right. They get out there and they play their heart out, but are free of the anxiety that often comes with getting ahead of ourselves.
Yeah.
Sleep has come up as well as another issue.
That's right. Yeah. So, some people asked. So, is mindfulness kind of like falling asleep? Is it the same state? And people Quite a lot of learners early on particularly get very caught up in mindfulness as a state, like it's some kind of state that we have to achieve and there's a way of doing it right and doing it wrong. And it's really not that. It's about being very much aware of what's happening right now.
You could notice sleepiness.
You could notice sleepiness, yeah. And it's not necessarily that mindfulness leads to relaxation. So if we're feeling relaxed after meditating, great. And if we're not, maybe we're just aware of some tension in the body, that kind of thing.
And
so
how we're responding to that tension and how that can amplify it.
That's right. Yeah.
So.
And I would say that mindfulness is about falling awake, not falling asleep. So if we're practicing it well, we're becoming more aware, more present, perhaps more relaxed.
Yeah.
But definitely it's not about getting into some sleepy state.
And mindfulness for sleeplessness, reruns of the past and what about tomorrow. So just being in the present moment. But many people think, I've got to stop the mind thinking in the middle of the night so I can get to sleep. So getting anxious about trying to get to sleep or getting angry about the mind, continually thinking about things will be a sure way to keep ourselves awake. So using mindfulness to help us to sleep means to just rest. And even if the mind's active, like it's like a busy highway, then just stand off the highway, sit on the side of the road and just watch the cars go by, as it were. And so we're not sort of drawn into it, and that can help us to rest, even if the mind's busy, and just coming back to the present moment and just, in a sense, resting in a non-judgmental, non-reactive kind of way.
And just enjoying being in bed, just
Yeah.
noticing the softness and the warmth and, not having to do anything for 8 hours. It's actually quite a nice thing to pay attention to, really.
But a lot has come up about the cognitive aspects of mindfulness and, whether acceptance and being non-judgmental makes us boring and, sometimes it's I think I've taken the mindfulness a little bit too far. I think it was better before. I don't think that that's necessarily the case at all. Non-judgmental doesn't mean not having discernment.
No.
About what's important, and this is an interesting thing to sort of flesh out. Being non-judgmental means, losing all discernment, and non-attachment, for example. Or letting go. Letting go doesn't mean getting rid of. Letting go of attachment to possessions doesn't mean, clear every possession out of the house. In fact, get rid of the house. What it means is the mental or emotional attachment to them. Now, if we let go of the attachment, we might clear a few things out, but at least we're not sort of so tied to those things, so tied to fixed an opinion, for example. And the non-attachment to opinion doesn't mean we may not still discuss or explore something, but it means that when we're very attached to an opinion, very often, even if we're wrong, we're going to argue black and blue that we're right because we can't let it go. And we lose our ability to actually adapt and shape. And, So there's lots of interesting things to discuss.
And by the same token, acceptance isn't resignation. It's sometimes accepting the effort required to create change.
Yes,
Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah. A couple of last things. We can plan and reflect mindfully. Again, it's not about always keeping our attention engaged with the senses and what's in front of us. We can do some very mindful planning, just thinking through what we want to do, and it's very different to worrying or just being distracted, and same with remembering, that kind of thing.
And a fountain of youth, yes, there's been a whole lot of research to show that mindfulness switches on the repair enzymes in the DNA, slows down the rate of aging as measured by telomeres and so on. I'm 156 years old, and I took it up when I was about 80, and it's really working for me. Yeah,
it's really helping.
How old are you now, Richard?
102.
So anyway, yes, there's a lot of interesting work. Of course, stress and worry and so on accelerates the aging process. So thank you very much. I hope this has been some useful feedback, and we'll look forward to seeing you next week as we move into week 4. And some of the practices in week 4 are a little bit challenging, so just take it gently and only engage in the practices you feel really comfortable with. So because some of them, can bring up things, and we want you to work gently and not step into things that you don't feel like you're not ready to work with. Anyway, look forward to seeing you next week.